Hey guys, tonight we're gonna dim the lights, settle into that comfortable spot on the couch or under the duvet, and let the chaos of the modern world just drift away. We're gonna travel back to Victorian London, a place of thick fog, cobblestones, and a social hierarchy so rigid you could practically hear it creak. But tonight's story isn't about the Great Exhibition or the expansion of the British Empire. No, tonight we're going to talk about a very strange, very persistent teenager who decided that the most private residence in the world was essentially his personal playground. So, adjust your pillows, let your eyes grow heavy, and listen to the curious, mildly creepy, and utterly baffling tale of Edward Jones, better known to the exasperated Victorian public as the Boy Jones. He wasn't a revolutionary, he wasn't a spy, and he wasn't particularly bright. He was just a boy who really, really liked Buckingham Palace. Like, a lot. He liked it so much, he decided to live there, right under the nose of Queen Victoria herself. Because why just read about the Queen when you can hide under her sofa? Our story begins in December 1838. Queen Victoria had only been on the throne for about a year and a half. She was 19, newly powerful, and living in the newly finished Buckingham Palace. Now, you'd think the residence of the most powerful woman on earth would be a fortress. You'd think there would be guards at every window and a security detail that could spot a fly from a mile away. But this was the 1830s. Security was mostly just a guy in a tall hat named Smith who occasionally checked the locks. Enter Edward Jones. Edward was 14 years old. He was the son of a tailor, and by all accounts, he was not what you'd call a shining light of his generation. He was described as having a very large head, a very small body, and a face that was perpetually covered in soot. He looked essentially like a chimney sweep who had forgotten his brush. He was a quiet boy, a bit of a loner, and he had developed a singular, laser-focused obsession. He wanted to see how the other half lived. And by the other half, he meant the Queen. One evening, Edward simply walked in. He didn't scale a wall or pick a lock. He found an unlocked door, likely left open by a careless servant, and just strolled into Buckingham Palace. And once he was inside, he didn't run, he didn't steal the crown jewels, he just started exploring. He spent several days living in the palace without anyone noticing. He slept in the chimneys, hid behind the heavy velvet curtains, and ate leftovers from the royal kitchens. He was essentially the world's first royal squatter. He was finally caught when a porter spotted him in the marble hall. When the guards grabbed him, they found something tucked inside his trousers that caused a scandal the papers would dine on for months. Edward had stolen a pair of Queen Victoria's linen trousers. Yes, the boy Jones had successfully infiltrated the royal apartments and made off with the Queen's underwear. Because if you're gonna risk prison, you might as well go for the most awkward souvenir possible. The court was understandably mortified. Victoria was not amused, though at 19 she was probably more weirded out than anything else. Edward was brought before a magistrate. His defense, he just wanted to see what the palace looked like and maybe write a book about it. He was essentially a 19th century travel blogger, just with more trespassing and less lighting. Because he was a minor and clearly a bit off, the judge gave him a light sentence. He was sent home to his father with a stern warning. But Edward Jones didn't do warnings. He did sequels. Let's float over to his second attempt, because why stop at one arrest when you can make it a trilogy? 2 years later, in December 1940, Edward decided it was time for a return visit. By this time, Victoria was married to Prince Albert and had just given birth to her first child, Princess Vicky. The palace was on high alert, or at least it was supposed to be. Edward managed to climb a wall, squeeze through a window, and once again, he made himself at home. He spent the night under a sofa in the Queen's private dressing room. Imagine the scene. The Queen of England is sitting there, brushing her hair, discussing the future of the Corn Laws with Albert, while a soot-covered teenager is curled up under the furniture right next to her feet, trying not to sneeze. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if the royal guards were actually just 3 raccoons in a trench coat. He was caught, of course. A housemaid heard a noise coming from under the sofa and, thinking it was a dog, reached under and grabbed Edward by the ear. When he was dragged out, he was found to be covered in soot again. He'd been hiding in the flue of the fireplace to stay warm. He was asked why he came back. His answer? He wanted to hear the Queen's private conversations. He also admitted that he'd sat on the throne, because if you're in the room, you might as well check the lumbar support. This second intrusion was a national embarrassment. The press started calling him the Boy Jones, and he became a sort of folk hero to the lower classes and a source of absolute terror for the government. How could a scruffy teenager bypass the best security in the world twice? The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, was personally involved in the case. They decided that Edward wasn't just a curious boy, he was a nuisance that needed to be erased. He was sentenced to 3 months of hard labor. Hard labor in a Victorian prison was no joke. It usually involved walking on a treadmill for 10 hours a day or picking oakum, unraveling old, tarry ropes until your fingers bled. But Edward took it in stride. He was a boy with a dream, and that dream involved gilded ceilings and royal leftovers. As soon as he was released, he went right back to the palace. Seriously, within weeks of leaving prison, he was caught for a 3rd time. This time, he was found in the royal larders, munching on some cold meat and a piece of pie. He had become so familiar with the palace layout that he was probably more comfortable there than in his own home. At this point, the authorities realized that prison wasn't working. Edward Jones was like a homing pigeon for Buckingham Palace. So they decided on a more permanent solution. They kidnapped him. No, really. The government essentially abducted him and forced him to join the Navy. They put him on a ship and told the captain to make sure he never set foot on English soil again. It was a classic Victorian solution. If you can't fix a problem, just sail it to the other side of the world. Poor Edward spent years at sea. He hated the Navy. He wasn't a sailor, he was a palace dweller. He tried to escape several times. Once, he jumped overboard in the middle of the ocean, hoping to swim back to London. He was rescued, dried off, and put back to work. Eventually, he did manage to sneak back to England, but the police were waiting for him. They caught him, put him on another ship, and sent him to Australia. In Australia, the Boy Jones finally faded into the background. He became a bit of a local character in Perth, where he worked as a town crier. Ironic for a man who spent his youth trying to be as quiet as possible. He struggled with alcoholism, likely a result of being snatched from his home and exiled for the crime of being a weird teenager. He eventually died in 1893 after falling off a bridge while drunk. It was a sad, lonely end for a man who had once sat on the throne of England and hidden under the Queen's sofa. But back in London, the legacy of the Boy Jones lingered. He was the reason Buckingham Palace finally got a proper security force. He was the reason the Metropolitan Police started taking palace duty seriously. He proved that even the most powerful people in the world are vulnerable to someone who is just really, really persistent. It's a strange, quiet tragedy, isn't it? A boy who was obsessed with a world he could never belong to, so he decided to inhabit it like a ghost. He didn't want to destroy the monarchy, he just wanted to be part of the furniture. And in a way, through the history books and the frustrated letters of Lord Melbourne, he finally achieved his goal. He became an inseparable part of the palace's story. Let's float away from the soot and the royal laundry now. Let's drift across the English Channel, away from the Victorian fog and toward the bright manicured lawns of 18th century France. We've seen the boy who wanted to be a royal. Now let's look at a royal who just wanted to be a simple farm girl. let's explore the pastel-colored, perfume-scented, and ultimately doomed world of Marie Antoinette's private village. So now that we've left Edward Jones, the boy who knew more about the underside of the Queen's furniture than most of her cabinet, let's float across the channel. We're leaving behind the soot of London and drifting toward the manicured, perfume-soaked gardens of Versailles. While the boy Jones was a commoner who desperately wanted to peek into the lives of the elite, our next subject was the most elite woman in the world, and she wanted nothing more than to play at being a commoner. It's a classic case of the grass always being greener, especially if that grass is part of a custom-built, multi-million-dollar fake farm. Tonight, we're going to settle into the pastel-colored, slightly delusional world of Marie Antoinette and her private retreat, the Hameau de la Reine. Imagine, if you will, being Marie Antoinette. You're 18 years old, you're the Queen of France, and your entire life is a series of public performances. We talked about Louis XIV and his morning waking ceremony. Well, by the time we get to the 1770s, that ritual had only gotten more suffocating. Marie Antoinette couldn't even put on her own stockings without a dozen duchesses arguing over who had the right to hand them to her. If she wanted a glass of water, it had to be passed through 5 different sets of hands before it reached her lips. It was a life of total luxury and total imprisonment. And so, because why not use the national treasury to build a literal escapist fantasy, Marie decided she needed a place to get away from it all. She commissioned the Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet. Now, when a normal person wants to get back to nature, they might go for a hike or plant some tomatoes in a window box. When Marie Antoinette wanted to get back to nature, she ordered the construction of a complete, working village on the grounds of Versailles. It had a farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, a dovecote, and a barn. But this wasn't just any village. It was designed to look authentically rustic, which in the 18th century meant it was built to look slightly decayed. The architects literally painted fake cracks on the walls and added artificial moss to the roofs to make it look like a charmingly weathered peasant town. It was essentially a Disney-fied version of poverty. The Queen would head out to her hamlet, trade her stiff silk corsets and massive powdered wigs for simple muslin dresses and straw hats, which, to be clear, still cost more than a peasant's house, and she would play at being a milkmaid. She had a herd of cows and sheep that were reportedly kept very clean. Some legends even suggest the cows were washed with scented water and had silk ribbons tied around their horns, which sounds like a lot of work for a cow that just wants to chew cud in peace. Marie and her closest friends would wander the gardens, carrying porcelain milk pails and pretending to churn butter. It was a picturesque, tranquil dream. But the problem was that just a few miles away, the actual peasants of France weren't playing. They were dealing with real cracks in their walls, real famine, and a very real lack of scented water. The contrast was, to put it mildly, a bit of a PR disaster. While Marie was in her hamlet, enjoying a quiet afternoon watching her pet goats, the people of Paris were starting to whisper. They called her Madame Deficit. They heard rumors of her fake village and imagined she was holding decadent, scandalous parties there. In reality, she was mostly just hiding from the duchesses and trying to find a moment of peace. But in the court of public opinion, the hamlet became a symbol of her utter obliviousness. She was a woman who was trapped between 2 worlds. In Versailles, she was criticized for being too casual and not respecting tradition. In the eyes of the public, she was criticized for being too extravagant. She couldn't win, so she retreated further into her bubble. She spent her time in the Petit Trianon, her private palace near the hamlet, where even the king was only allowed to visit if he had an invitation. Let's float over to her husband, Louis XVI. If Marie was a bird in a gilded cage, Louis was a man who would have been much happier as a locksmith. He was shy, he was socially awkward, and he had a very Habsburg potato quality to his personality. Though he was a Bourbon, the traits were similar. He loved clocks. He loved mechanical puzzles. He spent hours in his private workshop filing down metal and fixing hinges, while the French Revolution was slowly simmering on the stove. The tragedy of the French royals wasn't that they were evil in the way some history books suggest. It was that they were profoundly ill-equipped for the moment they were living in. They were like two people trying to read a map of a world that no longer existed. Louis XVI was a good man who was a terrible king. Marie Antoinette was a spirited woman who was a terrible queen for a country in crisis. As the revolution approached, the hamlet became a lonely place. The play acting stopped, the porcelain milk pails were put away. The queen who had wanted to be a simple shepherdess suddenly found herself at the center of a storm that no fake village could withstand. When the mob finally marched on Versailles in 1789, they weren't looking for a milkmaid, they were looking for the head of the monarchy. The end of Marie's story is a slow, gray drift toward the scalapode. From the bright, airy rooms of the Trianon to the cold, damp cells of the Cancellière. She aged 10 years in a few months. Her hair turned white. She lost her children, her husband, and eventually her life. But even in her final moments, she maintained that royal dignity she had once tried so hard to escape. There's a story that as she climbed the steps to the guillotine, she accidentally stepped on the executioner. Her last words were, "Monsieur, I ask your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." Even at the end, she was a queen of manners. It's a haunting image, the fake village sitting silent and empty in the moonlight, while the woman who built it faced the reality of a world that had no more room for porcelain pails. But let's leave the guillotine behind and float away from the French gardens. Let's drift toward a different kind of royal dysfunction. Let's look at a man who didn't want to hide in a fake village, but instead wanted to turn his entire country into a giant, disciplined army. We're moving toward Prussia, where the soldier king was creating a dynasty based on height, discipline, and a very peculiar obsession with tall fellows. Would you like to continue into the rigid, eccentric world of Frederick William I and his giant grenadiers, or perhaps explore the tragic, sickly nurseries of the Spanish Habsburgs? So, after leaving the silent, mossy cottages of Marie Antoinette's fake village, let's drift eastward. Let's float away from the French perfume and the porcelain pails, across the Rhine and into the cold, gray, and very disciplined plains of Prussia. We're moving into the early 18th century, to a court where the Sun King style of luxury was seen as a moral failing. Tonight, we're going to look at a man who took royal eccentricity and turned it into a very tall, very rigid military obsession. We're talking about Frederick William I, known to history as the Soldier King. And if you thought the boy Jones had a weird hobby, wait until you hear about Frederick's Potsdam Giants. Because why just have an army when you can have a collection of human skyscrapers? Now, Frederick William I was the polar opposite of the French Bourbons. He hated fancy clothes, he hated French food, and he especially hated the effeminate arts like music and dancing. He wore a simple military uniform every single day and spent his time obsessing over the state budget. He was a man of cold, hard facts and even colder discipline. But everyone has a weakness, and Frederick's weakness was height, specifically men who were over 6 feet tall. In the 1700s, the average height for a man was about 5'5". So when Frederick saw someone 6'2", he didn't just see a person, he saw a masterpiece. He decided to form a special regiment called the Potsdam Giants, or the Grand Grenadiers of Potsdam. The only requirement for entry was that you had to be at least 6 feet tall, but the taller, the better. He didn't want these men to actually fight. They were far too precious for that. He just wanted to look at them. He treated his giant soldiers like a modern billionaire might treat a collection of rare supercars.
He would have them march through his bedroom when he was sick to cheer him up. He'd have them perform drills in the palace while he sat and watched, probably nibbling on a piece of dry rye bread, which was his idea of a feast. But the way he acquired these giants was where things got truly dark and dysfunctional. He was so obsessed that he would spend a fortune bribing other European monarchs for their tallest citizens. He once paid a ridiculous sum to a tall Irishman to move to Prussia just so he could stand in the back row of the parade. And if people wouldn't come willingly, well, he wasn't above a little imperial kidnapping. His agents would travel across Europe, scouting for tall farmers, tall priests, even tall students. They'd lure them into a carriage or simply snatch them off the street. There's a story of a particularly tall carpenter who was asked to build a box of a certain size. When he finished it, the recruiter asked him to lie inside to prove it fit. As soon as he lay down, they nailed the lid shut and shipped him to Prussia. Unfortunately, the carpenter didn't survive the trip, which is a bit of a dampener on the tall guy collection. Frederick even tried to breed his own giants. He would force his tallest soldiers to marry the tallest women in Prussia, hoping to create a race of super soldiers. It didn't really work, mostly because biology doesn't always cooperate with royal decrees, but it shows how far he was willing to go for his aesthetic. Let's float over to his son, who would eventually become Frederick the Great. If Frederick William was the soldier king, his son was the flute-playing poet, and this caused one of the most brutal family meltdowns in history. Young Frederick loved French literature, he loved the flute, and he hated the military. His father thought he was unmanly and weak. The king treated his son with a cruelty that would be a national scandal today. He would beat him in public, mock him in front of the court, and force him to watch the execution of his best friend after they tried to run away to England together. It was a cold, loveless household where the only thing that mattered was the height of the guards and the discipline of the drill. The irony, of course, is that Frederick the Great, the flute player who was supposedly too soft, ended up being one of the greatest military commanders in history. But he never forgot the shadow of his father. When he finally became king, one of the first things he did was dissolve the regiment of giants. He kept a few around for nostalgia, but he wasn't interested in a human zoo. He wanted an army that could actually win battles, not just look impressive in a bedroom. The Soldier King eventually died in 1440, complaining to the end that the doctors were incompetent and that his coffin wasn't long enough. He was a man who built a kingdom of iron and tall men, but he left behind a son who was deeply traumatized and a court that was terrified of its own shadow. It's a strange, rigid sort of tragedy, isn't it? A man who sought perfection in a single physical trait, ignoring the humanity of the people he ruled. He turned his palace into a barracks and his son into a soldier, yet he ended his life alone, surrounded by giant guards who were only there because they had been bought or stolen. But let's leave the cold barracks of Potsdam now. Let's drift south, back towards the sun-drenched, dusty hills of Spain. We've seen the Soldier King. Now let's look at a family that was so obsessed with their own bloodline that they literally ate themselves into extinction. Let's float back towards the Habsburgs, but this time, let's look at the women who had to navigate a court where your only value was your pedigree and your ability to survive the doctors. So, after leaving the cold, rigid barracks of Prussia, where height was a currency and the flute was a crime, let's drift toward the frozen, wind-swept horizons of the north. We're moving toward a land of vast forests, golden-domed cathedrals, and a man who decided that his entire country needed a haircut. Tonight, we're going to walk through the unfinished, muddy streets of a city built on a swamp. We're going to look at a ruler who was nearly 7 feet tall, someone even the Soldier King would have tried to kidnap, but who was far more interested in pulling teeth and building ships than in standing still for a parade. Let's settle in with Peter the Great, the Tsar who dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the modern world, often while holding a pair of scissors and a very large bottle of vodka. Now, Peter was a man of, let's call it, unfiltered energy. He was a giant of a man, standing about 6 feet 8 in an era when most people were a foot shorter. He was constantly twitching, he had a nervous tic in his face, and he moved so fast that his courtiers had to jog just to keep up with him while he was having a casual stroll. But Peter's most defining trait wasn't his height, it was his obsession with westernizing Russia. You see, when Peter took the throne, Russia was still living in what was essentially the Middle Ages. The nobility, known as the boyars, wore long, heavy robes and massive, bushy beards that reached down to their waists. They spent their days in slow, solemn ceremonies and looked at the rest of Europe like it was a different planet. Peter, after traveling through Europe in disguise, though it's hard to stay in disguise when you're nearly 7 feet tall and constantly asking how to build a boat, decided this had to change. When he returned to Moscow, he didn't start with a speech. He started with a pair of shears. At his first official reception, he pulled out a pair of barber scissors and began personally lopping off the beards of his horrified nobles. Imagine being a high-ranking aristocrat, believing your beard is a sacred symbol of your status and your faith, and suddenly your czar is hacking it off in front of everyone like he's trimming a hedge. Because why not double down on the absurdity, Peter eventually realized he couldn't shave everyone himself. So he instituted a beard tax. If you wanted to keep your facial hair, you had to pay a fee and carry around a little bronze coin, a beard token, that proved you had paid for the right to look old-fashioned. On the coin, it literally said, "The beard is a useless burden." Peter was the ultimate New Year, New You enthusiast, but on an imperial scale. But Peter's eccentricity went far beyond grooming. He was obsessed with how things worked. He loved dentistry, which was unfortunate for anyone in his court who had a mild toothache. He carried a bag of dental tools with him everywhere, and if you so much as winced, he'd have you in a chair, pulling your tooth out with more enthusiasm than skill. He kept a collection of all the teeth he had pulled, which is a hobby that really tells you everything you need to know about his personality. He also had a grand embassy to Europe, where he worked as a common shipbuilder in the Netherlands. He wanted to learn everything: navigation, anatomy, clockmaking. He even visited a dissecting room and, seeing his Russian companions looking squeamish at a corpse, forced them to bite off a piece of the body's muscle just to toughen them up. He was a man of no boundaries and very little patience for the delicate nature of the elite. But the centerpiece of Peter's ambition was St. Petersburg. He decided to build a new capital on a piece of land that was essentially a freezing, mosquito-ridden marshland recently captured from Sweden. It was a terrible place for a city, but Peter wanted a window to the west. He forced thousands of peasants and prisoners to work in the mud, often with their bare hands because they lacked tools. Thousands died. The city was literally built on bones. And once the city was built, he forced the nobility to move there. They hated it. They had to build expensive stone houses in a swamp, learn to dress like Frenchmen, and attend assemblies where Peter forced them to drink massive amounts of alcohol and dance until they collapsed. If you were late to a party, your punishment was often having to drink a great eagle cup, a massive vessel filled with a liter of strong vodka. Peter's idea of social life was basically a mandatory, high-stakes fraternity party. But underneath the building of ships and the shaving of beards, Peter's personal life was a dark, chaotic mess. He had a son, Alexei, who was the total opposite of his father. Alexei was quiet, studious, and hated the military. He was a Habsburg potato of the Russian variety, weak and overwhelmed. Peter viewed his son's lack of greatness as a betrayal of Russia. Eventually, Alexei fled to Europe to escape his father's wrath. Peter, being the persistent giant he was, hunted him down, tricked him into returning, and then had him imprisoned and tortured to death for treason. He even forced the court to attend the funeral as if nothing was wrong. It was a brutal reminder that for Peter, the state always came before the family. In his later years, Peter became even more eccentric. He created a drunken council of his friends where they would dress up in ridiculous costumes and hold mock religious ceremonies. He had a collection of curiosities, deformed fetuses in jars, skeletons, and various medical oddities, which he kept in the Kunstkamera, Russia's first museum. He even made admission free, but since Russians weren't interested in looking at jars of organs, he offered a free glass of vodka to anyone who visited. Because in Peter's Russia, the answer to everything was usually a glass of vodka. He died in 1725, allegedly after jumping into freezing water to save some drowning sailors. It was a fittingly dramatic end for a man who lived his life at a permanent sprint. He left behind a city of stone, a modern navy, and a nobility that was now clean-shaven, but utterly terrified. It's a strange, heavy legacy, isn't it? A man who wanted to make his people civilized by using the most uncivilized methods possible. He built a window to the west, but the view was often obscured by the shadows of the people he broke along the way. Let's float away from the cold stone palaces of St. Petersburg now. Let's drift back toward a warmer climate, but one no less filled with royal dysfunction. Let's look at a family that was so entangled in their own greatness that they eventually lost sight of the world outside their palace walls.